CBS Young, and the Restless spoilers. The hospital had a way of stripping Genoa City of its usual glitter and noise, reducing everything to sterile light, muted footsteps, and the unbearable honesty of time running out. Even for a family like the Abbott's Woe had survived boardroom wars, scandals, betrayals, and the kind of private grief that never makes the headliness this place. Always felt like a final court where no money, no reputation, no carefully constructed narrative could win an appeal. Jill Abbott lay in that narrow bed as if the entire force of her life had been condensed into the fragile rise and fall of her chest. The woman who once filled rooms with her willpower now looked smaller than the sheets that covered her, her skin faintly translucent under the harsh lights, her lips dry, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion that no pep talk could shame away. Machines kept count of her body's quiet surrender in soft, repetitive beeps. And the sound was so steady that it almost felt cruel, like a metronome reminding everyone that the world kept moving even as hers prepared to stop. Nurses came and went with professional gentleness, adjusting tubes and checking numbers, speaking in careful tones that never promised anything. But the real truth lived in the way Jill's fingers trembled against the blanket, in the way her breath came thinner each hour, as if she were already learning how to let go. There were no grand speeches here, no dramatic entrances, no strategic pivots. Only the slow, humiliating certainty that Jill was nearing the end, and that whatever she carried inside her, whatever she had buried and protected and justified for Decatus, was now pressing against the surface, demanding to be spoken before it died with her. Cane Ashby writhed like someone chasing the last train out of town, not because he believed he could change what was happening, but because he couldn't live with himself if he wasn't there when it happened. He didn't walk into the hospital so much as he broke into it, his urgency making him look almost guilty, like a man afraid he'd waited too long even though he had run the moment he got the call. His hair was slightly disheveled, his jacket thrown on as an afterthought, his eyes raw with an emotion he had not fully named yet, something between dread and denial, grief and anger, as if he were bracing for a blow he could already feel coming. Cane had always been a man who understood pressure. He had lived his life in the crossfire of power, loyalty, ambition, and family expectation. And he had learned to survive by adapting, by negotiating, by refusing to be permanently defined by other people's assumptions. But there was no negotiating with the sight of Jill in that bed, so diminished and pale, her once commanding presence reduced to a whisper of itself. The moment he stepped into the room, his composure cracked in a way he did not expect. His throat tightened, his eyes burned, and something inside him, part that still wanted to be strong, to be useful, to be in control, fell apart because none of those things mattered now. Cane moved to her bedside without hesitation, his hand reaching for hers as if touch could hold her here. Jill's fingers were cold and light, and when he closed his hand around them, he felt the shocking truth of her fragility, the sense that he was holding something already slipping away. He leaned in close, trying to read her face for signals, for permission, for any indication that she could still hear him, still recognize him, still had the strength to fight. His voice came out low and strained, the tone of someone speaking to a person he loved and feared losing. Even if his relationship with Jill had not always been simple or safe, he told her he was here. He told her she wasn't alone. He told her to rest, to breathe, to stay with him. He did not realize that his very presence was the key Jill had been waiting for, the final witness she needed before she released the secret that had lived inside her like a stone. Jill's eyes fluttered open more fully when she sensed him. And for a brief moment, the old Jill was there, sharp, searching, painfully aware. It wasn't the kind of awareness that promised recovery. It was the awareness of someone choosing her last act, her gaze fixed on Kane's face as if she were memorizing it, as if she were measuring how much truth he could endure. Kane's grip tightened instinctively, and his mouth parted as if he wanted to ask what she needed, what the doctors were saying, what he could do. But Jill's throat worked with effort, her breath rasping, and what came out was not small talk, not reassurance, not a gentle farewell. What came out was urgency disguised as weakness, a confession wrapped in the thin air of a failing body. She pulled in a shallow breath that seemed to hurt, her eyes wet with more than illness. And then she spoke with a voice that barely sounded like hers. Each word scraped out as if it cost her something physical to release it. She said his name, not the way people usually did in Genoa City, as a label or a reminder, but as a plea. Cane leaned closer, his forehead almost touching the sheets, his focus narrowing to her mouth because he was terrified he would miss whatever she was trying to say. Jill's fingers twitched in his grasp as if she were trying to hold him still, to anchor him in place long enough to deliver what she had carried for a lifetime. Then, in a breath that sounded too thin to hold the weight of what it contained, Jill told him the truth she had kept hidden behind years of deflection and control. Cane was not just someone she cared about, not just a complicated chapter in her history, not just a man she had influenced from a distance. Cane was her son, her biological son. The words were quiet, almost fragile, but they landed with the force of an earthquake because they rearranged everything past, present, identity, loyalty into a new, terrifying shape. Cane froze so completely that for a second it seemed like even his breathing stopped. His mind rejected the sentence as impossible because it didn't match the world he had lived in. But Jill's gaze did not waver. Her eyes held his like a chain, and the regret in them was unmistakable. The kind of regret that only exists when someone has loved and betrayed at the same time. Kane's first reaction was not clarity, but a violent confusion. Like a man waking from a dream and not knowing which parts were real. He stared at Jill as if she had spoken in another language. His grip remained locked around her hand, but his body went rigid, and the blood seemed to drain from his face. His thoughts surged and collided. How could this be true? Why would she say this now? Was she delirious? Was this a cruel hallucination born from fever and pain? Yet the look on Jill's face was too deliberate, too sharp, too devastated to be random. She wasn't rambling. She wasn't misremembering. She was choosing. She was giving him something she had denied him for years. And she was doing it at the one moment when he could not ask for proof or demand explanations, without seeming like a monster. Kane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes stung with tears he didn't understand because the emotion was too complex to be called by a single name. Part of him wanted to run from the room, to escape the suffocation of that statement. Part of him wanted to shout, to demand every detail, to tear through the decades with the force of his anger. Another part quaked, almost childlike, wanted to believe it instantly because it explained an ache he had never fully justified, the sense that he was always searching for a place he could never quite find, the sensation that he belonged to something he could not name. Jill watched him struggle, her own face contorting with a pain that went beyond her physical condition. She tried to speak again, but the effort made her cough weakly, and the sound was raw. Her eyes filled and spilled over, tears sliding into her hairline. And for the first time, Cane saw her not as the indestructible Jill Abbott, but as a mother cornered by her own choices. She communicated more with her expression than her voice could carry now an apology. That had waited too long, an admission that the secret had been protected not only by fear, but by pride, by a stubborn belief that she could control the consequences. If she simply never let the truth exist out loud, outside the room, in the corridor where families paced and tried to pretend they weren't terrified. Billy Abbott had stopped moving. He hadn't meant to be there in that exact moment. He had arrived at the hospital with the restless, clenched energy of a man bracing for loss, wanting answers he knew no one could offer. He had been told Jill was declining quickly. He had been told to come, and yet some part of him had delayed, not out of indifference, but out of dread because Billy had spent so much of his life loving Jill and fighting her, resenting her and needing her. And the idea of facing the end felt like confronting a complicated truth he had never resolved. He had approached her room with the intention of going in. But when he saw Cane already at her bedside through the small opening in the door, Billy hesitated. A bitter flicker moved through Hyman Old, familiar sting of being second, of arriving late to something important, of watching someone else occupy the space he believed belonged to him. Yet that jealousy was quickly replaced by something softer and more shameful. Guilt that he had ever measured love like a competition. Billy stayed in the hall, telling himself he would wait until Cane stepped out. He told himself his mother needed peace. He told himself he was doing the right thing. Then Jill spoke, and the corridor might as well have been a vacuum because Billy heard every word as if it had been, delivered directly into his skull. Cane is my son. The sentence slithered into Billy's chest and tightened around his heart. He did not gasp. He did not cry out. He simply stood there, one hand braced against the wall, the other hanging uselessly by his side. His face going blank in a way that was more terrifying than rage because it looked like a man. Watching his entire life rearrange itself in real time, Billy's mind tried to reject it too, but unlike Cane, Billy was not hearing it for the first time as a direct recipient of the confession. Billy was hearing it as collateral damage, as a man whose identity had been built on being Jill's son, her Abbott son, her heir, her endless source of worry and pride and disappointment. He had shaped his rebellion around that bond. He had turned his pain into defiance because he believed she was his mother. And that was the axis around which his entire emotional history spun. If Jill was saying Cane was her biological son, then what did that make Billy? A son still, perhaps, but suddenly the ground beneath that word felt unstable. He felt the world tilt, the corridor narrowing, his breath catching. It wasn't just shock. It was humiliation, betrayal, and grief all blended into one sickening wave. Because the truth Jill had hidden for years didn't just change Cane's story. It rewrote Billy's in a way that made him question every memory. Was he loved the way he thought he was loved? Or had he been a substitute? Had he been protected? Or had he been manipulated? Had Jill's fiercest moment your control? Her criticism? Her suffocating involvement been fueled by maternal devotion? Or by the desperate need to keep the real secret from rising to the surface? Inside the room, Cane finally found his voice. But it came out as a broken question rather than a coherent response. He asked how, why, when his words tangled because they were trying to drag decades into a single breath. Jill attempted to answer, her lips moving carefully, her gaze flickering with shame. She told him, in fragments and with pauses forced by her failing lungs, that she had hidden the truth because she believed she had to, because the timing had been wrong, because the consequences would have destroyed more than just reputations. She hinted at choices made in panic and pride, at decisions she had framed as protective even when they were selfish. She tried to convey that she had watched him grow from a distance with the strange pain of a mother, not allowed to claim her own child, that she had interfered in his life in subtle ways, that she had tried to guide him without revealing the reason. Cane's eyes filled, and for a moment his anger softened into something like mourning for a version of his life he never got to have. Yet the anger returned quickly because loss doesn't erase betrayal. If Jill had known all this time, then every interaction between them had been contaminated by omission. Every argument, every moment of support, every time he had felt judged or abandoned, there had been another layer beneath it. A reason he had never been permitted to understand. Cane's grip on her hand trembled, not because he wanted to let go, but because he wanted to hold on while simultaneously wanting to punish the truth for arriving too late. And then there was Billy, still in the corridor, listening as if he were trapped in a nightmare he could not wake from. He had always thought of Cane as an outsider in certain ways, a man who moved between worlds, connected to powerful people, but never entirely belonging. Now Billy understood why that perception had always felt slightly off. Cane hadn't been orbiting the Abbotts. He had been connected to them by blood in a way no one admitted. The realization punched Billy with a new kind of envy, sharper than any jealousy he had ever felt over business or relationships, because this was primal. This was motherhood. This was the source code of family. Billy's mind started spiraling through the implications. Was he still Jill's son? If biology wasn't on his side, did that matter? It shouldn't, he told himself, because love was not a DNA test, because Jill had raised him, fought him, feared for him, sacrificed for him. But the human heart is not always logical, and Billy's heart was screaming that something sacred had been taken from him. He remembered every time Jill had pushed him to be better, every time she had looked at him with disappointment, every time she had compared him openly or set little other people. Had she been shaping him because she loved him, or because she was trying to fill the void left by the child she couldn't claim? Billy felt nauseated as his memories rearranged themselves into a new, uglier pattern. He imagined Jill holding Cane as a baby, imagined her making the choice to hide him, imagined her living with that lie while looking Billy in the eyes and calling him her son. The contradiction made Billy's skin prickle with rage. Yet beneath the rage was fear. The deepest fear of all, that Jill's last truth might leave him standing alone, unsure where he fit, unsure whether the title of son still belonged to him in the only way that had ever mattered. Jill's breathing grew worse, and even Cane's storm of questions began to fade because the room itself was signaling that time was running out. The machine's rhythm became the only stable thing in the chaos. Jill's eyes stayed locked on Cane's, and there was a fierce urgency in the way she searched his faces. If she needed him to understand one thing clearly before she left, her mouth moved again, forming words that came out almost soundless, and Cane leaned closer, tears sliding down his cheeks without him noticing. She told him she was sorry. She told him she had been wrong. She told him she had loved him, even from a distance, even when her love was expressed in the wrong ways, in controlling ways, in ways that tried to manage his life rather than embrace it. Cane's jaw clenched, his entire body trembling with the unbearable complexity of it. To be given a mother in the same moment he was about to lose her. The irony was almost cruel. He could not digest it fast enough. He could not decide whether to forgive or condemn. He could only sit there, holding her hand, watching her fade, knowing that the answers he wanted were evaporating along with her breath. In the corridor, Billy finally moved, not forward, but backward, as if the truth had physical force that pushed him away. He covered his mouth with his hand, not to silence a sobbing house. He wasn't sobbing yet, but to keep himself from making a sound that would reveal he had heard, that would drag him into the room and force an immediate confrontation while Jill's heart still beat. He didn't know whether he wanted to burst in and demand an explanation or run out of the hospital and pretend this moment never happened. His entire life had just been cracked open, and he had no idea What would spill out when it fully broke? Jill's final moments were not dramatic in the way Genoa City liked its dramas. There were no thunderclaps or sudden speeches. There was only the slow, irreversible dimming of her presence. Her hand in Kane's grew heavier and then strangely weightless, as if the body's last surrender had changed the laws of touch. Her eyes fluttered, trying to stay open, trying to remain anchored to the faces she had loved and complicated. Kane whispered her name again and again, not as a question this time, but as a desperate chant, as if repeating it could keep her here. Jill's lips parted, and for a fleeting second, there was a softness in her expression that looked like peace, or like relief that she had finally spoken the truth regardless of the wreckage it would cause. Then her chest stilled. The monitor's steady rhythm faltered and changed, and the sound that followed was the most terrifying kind of silence. That meant the story had ended whether anyone was ready or not. Nurses rushed in, voices quick and controlled, hands moving with trained urgency that was already too late. Kane stumbled back half a step, still holding Jill's hand, as if he couldn't accept the physical finality of death. He looked at her face, searching for movement, for a sign of correction, for any hint that this was not real. But Jill Abbott was gone. The woman who had controlled so much, who had shaped so many lives, had left the world with one last act of control. She had released a truth, designed to detonate after her departure. Kane sat there in the aftermath, stunned into stillness, his grief complicated by the fact that he had just lost the only person who could fully confirm and explain what she had confessed. He felt as if his identity had been rewritten by a hand that vanished the moment it finished writing. He was Jill's son. The words sounded impossible, yet Jill's face in those last seconds had been too sincere for doubt. Kane's mind raced through his past, scanning for clues, reinterpreting interactions, hunting for moments that now made terrible sense. A childhood memory that had always felt slightly off. A look Jill had given him once across a crowded room. The way she had defended him in certain situations more fiercely than logic required. The puzzle pieces began to connect, but instead of creating comfort, they created a new kind of grief. Grief for a life that might have been. Grief for a bond that had existed in secret rather than in the open where it belonged. And then there was Billy, still outside, still not breathing properly, still trying to decide whether to step forward now that Jill could no longer stop him. He stared at the door as if it were the threshold between the man he had been and the man he was about to become. Jill's death should have been the main tragedy, but her confession had twisted it into something else, an inheritance of shock and instability that would ripple through their family long after the funeral flowers wilted. Billy felt the first tears finally break free, not because he had resolved anything, but because his body could no longer contain the collapse. He wasn't just mourning Jill. He was mourning the certainty he used to have about himself. He was mourning the version of his relationship with his mother that now felt stained by the suspicion that he had never known her completely. He realized, with an almost unbearable clarity, that Jill had left behind to Sanson, newly claimed by blood in the moment before she died, and one who suddenly didn't know what claim meant anymore. The future that waited beyond the hospital doors was not a simple continuation. It was a storm. Kane would have to decide whether being Jill's biological son was a gift or a curse, whether it meant power, belonging, responsibility, or merely pain. Billy would have to decide whether love without biology could survive this kind of revelation, whether he could remain Jill's son in his heart without resenting the truth that had reshaped him. And somewhere in the silent space between them, with Jill's final breath still echoing in the air, the Abbott family's next chapter began it with triumph or reconciliation, but with a fracture so deep it threatened to change everything they thought they knew about loyalty, identity, and the meaning of family itself.